Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening from myself. I'm Daniele Fattibene, researcher at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. We are very pleased to be with you today discussing about a very relevant topic on which we have worked throughout this year. The webinar of today will help us address how the G20 can bring the voice of the least developed country in its policy agenda. Let me just give very few rules of the game. First of all, let me thank UNCTAD for having supported and sponsored this project, and also the Think 20 in the framework of which this project has been conducted. IAI has been appointed by the Prime Minister Office as a scientific partner for the Italian presidency of the G20 and is co-chair of the Think 20 engagement group. The event will be recorded. We will provide in the next days the link on our YouTube channel, and we are also live on Facebook. You can use the Q&A function to raise your questions to our speakers and panelists, whom I very much thank for being with us today. And I'm also taking this opportunity to remind you that we are sharing today the findings of a joint report that we've published with UNCTAD. And in this regard, let me thank the whole UNCTAD team for the work, the impressive work done in this month. But without no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Paula Kivumi, Director of the Division for Africa and LDC and Special Programs at UNCTAD. And again, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you very much, Daniele, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Your Excellency, Ambassador Salama and good friend, thank you very much for your leadership with the LDC issues in the run-up to UNCTAD 15 and also to run-up to LDC 5. Distinguished panelists and esteemed participants, ladies and gentlemen, for me, it is a great pleasure to be with you here and to open this think tank roundtable on how the G20 can bring the voice of least developed countries into this policy agenda. This event has been a culmination of a year of joint work between UNCTAD and the Istituto Affari Internazionali and my division for Africa, least developed countries and special programs. And throughout the past year, we have been forging a new partnership and strengthening our collaboration with the T20 and its Africa Standing Group. And I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to the IAI colleagues, and especially Mr. Fattibene and Mr. Greco for their fruitful experience and collaboration. And I hope and I trust it will not end here with this project. And now the aim, as mentioned, of today's event is to foster a reflection on how the G20 can advance the interests of LDCs in its policy agenda. How can the G20 engage in LDCs in a more inclusive manner by reflecting their policy priorities more effectively? And in a nutshell, perhaps we could say that, and I could borrow from the language from our newly adopted Bridgetown Covenant, which is from our UNCTAD 15 conference, which reads, quote unquote, that today we are engaging in a broad-based and constructive dialogue of strengthening and revitalizing multilateralism and international cooperation. As part of this discussion, today we are also launching, as Mr. Fab mentioned earlier on, the joint publication. And it will focus on three main themes of immediate relevance to African countries and to LDCs. And the study focuses on, firstly, how to increase their participation and visibility in the G20 process. And secondly, on how best to support investment in quality and climate resilient infrastructure. And thirdly, how to boost their access to sustainable development finance. Ladies and gentlemen, before I delve deeper into these issues, let me start by recalling a little bit about the context in which this timely and relevant event is taking place today. As you all know, we are roughly a year and a half in the COVID pandemic. And to date, this crisis has cost the global economy approximately $10 trillion. It has also triggered a decline in the Human Development Index for the first time since UNDP launched the Human Development Report in 1990. At this stage, the estimates for 2020 suggest that the global economy may partially recover the grounds lost in 2020. However, troublingly, unequal access to vaccines and widespread asymmetries in countries' capacity to respond to the downturn are already giving rise to a divergent recovery. The LDCs and other developing countries, including those in Africa, are bearing the brunt of this burden. Moreover, this will weigh down these countries' prospects for achieving the 2030 agenda. Now, if the COVID pandemic has underscored that vulnerability and interdependence are common features across development and developing countries alike, it has also been a painful reminder of the deep-seated asymmetries, that structurally weaknesses that exacerbate in LDC situation. Now, due to the effects of the pandemic in 2020, LDCs experienced their worst economic performance in 30 years. Unlike most developed countries, LDCs are now expected to take an average of 3 to 4 years to recover their pre-existing levels of GDP. As many as a dozen LDCs are expected to take 5 years or more to return to their pre-pandemic levels. And such a protracted slump will likely generate enormous social costs, as we can see. The crisis has already resulted in 35 million additional people in LDCs living in extreme poverty, which brings the poverty headcount to a ratio of 34%. Moreover, fundamentally, however, the prospect of a sluggish K-shaped recovery threatened to undermine the LDC's ability to foster their productive capacity development. This can potentially thwart even the incipient signs of structural transformation that some of the best performing LDCs were displaying prior to the onset of the pandemic. Now, beyond these grim prospects, there is another reason why today's conversation and dialogue could be more relevant. This event comes at a time when the international community is set to take key decisions for the future. This will happen within the G20, but also at the upcoming COP26, at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, and during the 5th United Nations Conference on LDCs. Now, these are important multilateral events which will all take place in a space of just a few months. In this context, and considering the serious risks of further widening of the global inequalities, what is needed is a revitalized multilateral capability of supporting LDCs in addressing their structural vulnerabilities. It is in this spirit that UNCTAD continues to call for global partnership in support of LDCs that go beyond the moral commitment to leave no one behind. It also represents an investment in global public goods and in systemic resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now turn to some of the key takeaway messages that have emerged from our work with IAI and the T20. First, there is no doubt that the G20 has come to represent a critical forum for multilateral action on sustainable development issues. Its decisions have an important bearing on a whole range of vulnerable countries that fall outside its membership, from Africa to the LDCs. Yet, if we are to improve the legitimacy and, above all, the effectiveness of measures to promote the right to sustainable development for all, we cannot overlook the importance of participation, visibility, and inclusion. We need to support countries, first and foremost, the most vulnerable ones, such as the LDCs, in their capacity development efforts. We must empower these institutions to articulate their needs, enhance their development strategies, and exert their priorities. This is why it was so important for us to provide a platform to involve LDC think tanks and broader stakeholders in today's discussion. Secondly, UNCTAD has long argued that productive capacities lie at the core of the development process. Their expansion is the safest avenue to structurally transform economies, generate productive jobs, and build resilience. In this context, the development of key infrastructure deserves primary emphasis. Now, infrastructure development must not only be viewed as a determinant of investment, rather it should be considered more broadly, recognizing the essential role it plays in firms' performance. In the LDC context, the very achievement of the Agenda 2030 hinges on bridging long-standing gaps in climate-resilient infrastructure provision. The same goes for ICT development and digitization. COVID-19, with its has accelerated penetration of digital technologies, is a stark reminder that firms with reliable energy provision, good connectivity, and related skills with more resilient and faster in adapting to the new normal. Against this backdrop, the G20 can surely play a conducive role in promoting climate change adaptation through effective infrastructure maintenance systems. The G20 can also champion the adoption of higher environmental standards in the planning and design of infrastructure projects and supporting the dissemination of guidelines and best practices. What is equally critical, ladies and gentlemen, is a broader, coherent framework to fully harness the synergies between infrastructure development and structural transformation. And in this regard, investment in infrastructure and industrial policy objectives must be mutually supportive. Regional and sub-regional approaches could be particularly promising in this regard as well. The experience of the economic corridors in the Greater Mekong sub-region and the ongoing rollout of the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa and of the African Continental Free Trade Area are just a few telling examples. And this leads me to my third point. The necessity of an inclusive and sustainable recovery. A recovery capable of closing key infrastructure gaps in LDCs will only be possible with commensurate investment. Yet LDCs have limited access to development finance, as we know, even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the situation today has even worsened. For instance, the ratio of total external debt stocks to exports for LDCs has risen from 158% in 2019 to 202% in 2020. In this respect, many of the actions already undertaken by the G20, which notably are the Debt Service Suspension Initiative and the Common Framework for Debt Treatments, are a step in the right direction. However, unfortunately, still fall short of what is needed given the gravity of the situation we now face. Innovative financial mechanisms ranging from blending finance and sustainability bonds to the redistribution of newly issued special drawing rights could play an important role in this respect. But more should be done if we are to avoid another lost decade. Ladies and gentlemen, to fully grasp the scale of related challenges, the LDCs only received approximately 2.1% of the new SDR allocation from the IMF. And between 2012 and 2018, LDCs accounted for only 6% of the total private finance mobilized through blended instruments. Now, these figures speak for themselves and make it clear why we are having this discussion today. They all reinforce why we at UNCTAD called for a concerted international action to support an inclusive and sustainable recovery. These numbers underscore why a 21st century generation of international support measures for LDCs are needed to be a core element of international action. With these words, I'd like to, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all and wish you all a very interactive and fruitful discussion. And I look forward to the continued collaboration we'll have in the future. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to pass the floor to my dear friend, Ambassador Salama, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of Malawi to the United Nations and other international organizations. Ambassador, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, as coordinator of the LDC group here in Geneva, it is a distinct pleasure for me to be invited as a keynote speaker at this Think 20 roundtable on how the G20 can bring the voice of the least developed countries into its policy agenda. The theme of today's roundtable could not be timelier, and I commend UNCTAD, IAI, and the G20 African Standing Group for taking the initiative to organize this much needed debate and bring together distinguished experts from G20 countries as well as from the LDC. As Paul said, the pandemic has dramatically exposed our interdependence and common vulnerabilities, but also the deep-seated fault lines across countries. Despite laudable international initiatives such as COVAX, as of mid-2021, only 2% of LDC population has been vaccinated, compared to 41% in developed countries. Similarly, while the pandemic accelerated digitalization in some parts of the world, almost half of the world's population continue to lack access to internet. In the LDCs, for example, only 19% of individuals are connected online. On the medium term, lower investments, rising food insecurity, and widespread disruptions to education depress fiscal and human capital accumulation, weighing down future growth in LDCs. A reflection of these unbalanced trends is the ongoing two-speed recovery, which threatens to widen existing inequalities and undermine LDC ability to meet their sustainable development goals. Ladies and gentlemen, avoiding the prospects of another lost decade for development requires a bold and inclusive multilateral response. Few months away from the adoption of the new program of action at UN LDC 5 in Qatar, Doha, this holds especially true for the LDCs, a category created 50 years ago, precisely to support the world's most vulnerable countries. In this respect, there are three lessons that should, in my humble view, inform our agenda for an inclusive recovery. First, sustainable development and indigenous resilience are best rooted in the development of LDC productive capacities and in the process of structural transformation. Countries with more sophisticated production structures and greater technological capacities have proved to be not only less exposed to exogenous shocks, but also better placed to devise innovative ways to restore dynamism. They have also been more effective in mobilizing resources to finance counter-cycle policies, cushion the impact of crisis, and support the working of critical institutions, be it in the health and education sector or in transport and logistics. Moreover, structural transformation is imperative for LDCs because reliance on commodity exports, foreign services can only go so far during a boom, but in bad times, they have invariably proved to be additional source of vulnerability. Second, ladies and gentlemen, Most LDCs have responded in an encouraging way to the pandemic, mobilizing resources, engaging a broad range of partners, and especially in Africa, coordinating their actions through regional and sub-regional institutions. The rollout of the African Union, Africa Vaccine Acquisition Trust, or the work of regional economic communities in streamlining custom procedures for sensitive products show what can be achieved with leadership, political will, and concerted response. This bodes very well for establishment of an African continental free trade area and for Agenda 2063. Yet, if proactive response are encouraging, it remains clear that the development outcomes depend on adequate means of implementation. In this respect, the resources available to LDCs remain a tiny fraction of those needed for their sustainable development, as confirmed by UNCTAD's recent LDC report 2021. Meanwhile, international support continues to fall far short of long-standing promises, from the 0.1 to 0.2% ODA target enshrined in the SDGs to the $100 billion per year in climate finance included in the Paris Agreement. This leads me to my third point, ladies and gentlemen, namely that an inclusive recovery for LDCs hinges on a more conducive international environment, as well as a new generation of international support measures. This implies reflecting LDC's legitimate interests and development needs in the solution of systematic issues such as debt sustainability, financial stability, or climate change. It also means going beyond tokenistic approaches in the establishment of international support measures, and rather, and I repeat, rather, establishing meaningful and adequately funded mechanisms to improve LDC's integration into the global economy. To do so, ladies and gentlemen, the specific vulnerability distinct LDCs from those in the process of graduating to those in a situation of conflict need to be taken into serious consideration and addressed in a coherent and holistic way. Ladies and gentlemen, developing a fairer international environment and a new generation of international support measures are, in my view, the key priorities in the lead up to the UN LDC 5 conference. And I'm convinced that the G20 can play an important role in advancing this inclusive agenda through its decisions. In this way, this is why this roundtable is so relevant for the prospects of the LDCs. Let me conclude by welcoming this important initiative and wishing you all very interactive and fruitful discussions. I look forward to your deliberations. I thank you. Merci beaucoup. Asante sana. Muito obrigado. Zikomo kwambiri tatenda and muchas gracias.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for a thought-provoking statement, and which will surely set the stage for this very interesting workshop, which will happen now in discussion. Now, to move forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome. To move forward, I'd like to now pass the floor to Junior Davis, who's the head of the Policy Analysis Research Branch in my division, and he will reflect a little bit on giving us a more specific context, and then we will move on with the panelists. Junior, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Excellencies, distinguished panel members, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And thank you, Ambassador Salama and Mr. Akawimi, for your insightful opening statements. I think taken together, these statements give us a broad view of what is needed for developing countries, especially in Africa and LDCs, as they pursue graduation from the LDC status, the development of productive capacities, and structural transformation as the basis for building back better in the post-pandemic world. Aiming at supporting developing countries and the most vulnerable of them to build back differently, the G20 provides a unique opportunity to seek tangible outcomes that would help the recovery process, developing and structurally weak and vulnerable economies such as the LDCs and small island developing states. So my task this afternoon is just to briefly distill some of the key observations from the study being discussed today on how the G20 can bring the voice of the LDCs into the policy agenda. As noted by the previous speakers, the paper itself aims to investigate the role that G20 Presidency can play to address the core institutional and development challenges LDCs face, particularly in the areas of finance and infrastructure. But I would say, in fact, that in terms of the analysis presented in the study, the ambition of the study clearly goes beyond this. It's comprised of 3 chapters, which broadly focus on the following issues: the role of African countries within the G20 process and how to enhance it, the role of quality and climate resilient infrastructure to boost sustainable development in LDCs, and finally, the paper speaks to development finance and how the G20 can support and identify innovative mechanisms to mobilize financial resources for Africa and LDCs. Now, with such a rich study, there are inevitably a wide range of findings and useful policy recommendations which emerge. And I guess the specific things that struck me most profoundly and may to some extent be deliberated upon today in no specific order were as follows. First, the need for greater agency and empowerment for Africa and LDCs in international affairs. This is fundamental to addressing the lack of inclusivity in global decision-making, most notably on tax, illicit financial flows and finance, the important role of multilateralism and the G20 in particular in encouraging participation by African countries in global governance on a range of challenging issues is made very clear in the report. Secondly, inequality features here and there in the study. Inequality between rich and poor countries in terms of access to finance, liquidity, and abilities to respond effectively to shocks, especially climate change and COVID-19, needs to be better addressed by the international community. And the G20 has a role to play in this, especially with respect to financing climate resilient infrastructure. And I would go further. I think there's a subtext of the study, and it is that the multilateral system, and by that I mean including international financial systems, is weakening, and it's not benefiting developing countries, LDCs, and emerging economies as much as advanced economies. So, multilateral response mechanisms to the climate crisis and pandemic, will require much more rapid response. And as we've seen, and as I think was previously noted, the international response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been much more limited in terms of impact in LDCs, vis-a-vis access to vaccines and financing national response measures. Not only did the bulk of the special drawing rights go to the richer countries, but lower than anticipated resources were mobilized under the debt suspension initiative for LDCs. So the study makes a convincing case for the need for more innovative ways to create safer financial assets for developing countries that are still borrowing at very high cost. For example, facilitating the issuance of sustainable or green bonds and COVID debt with longer maturities and better terms, which could help address LDC liquidity needs. In the study, there's also an emphasis on the need for a reallocation of special drawing rights and how this would work. And I found this particularly interesting because there are various ideas articulated, such as providing SDRs through the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. But I think there's also a need to channel SDR finance through regional development banks or resilience and sustainability trusts so that they can be more concessional, reduce the risk of debt distress, and have a better development impact. So we observed from the study, I would say, clear examples of the development challenges that LDCs face, many of which have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. These are among the subjects of discussion by today's panel, and I think particularly how a reinvigorated multilateralism involving the G20 can help LDCs overcome these challenges and achieve their national development objectives. This study is also clear about how the universal nature of the threats posed by climate change underlines the need for regional cooperation in these efforts. And it calls, I think rightly, on the international community and the G20 to better incorporate LDC priorities into their development assistance program. Looming over this vision and analysis, a debt crisis threatens LDC's response to the pandemic and their development agenda, stressing the urgent need to extend broad-based debt relief over the coming years so as to avoid a lost development decade. This is a rich basis on which to open our panel session and later discussions. If you haven't had a chance to look at the paper, I would really urge you to do so. It's a really good read. So with that, I look forward to the discussions to follow, and I hand over to my colleague, Giovanni Valenzizi, who will facilitate the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junior, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to kick off this roundtable. I think the gist of the report has been already discussed. Well, what's left to me is just to essentially facilitate this discussion. We have the luck and honor to have an excellent list of panelists who play a key role, whether in the G20 process or in related processes and discussion. Starting from Ms. Loredana Magni, who's been working with the Directorate General for Development Cooperation in the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the last 25 years. And prior to that, she was working with the ILO and a few Italian NGOs. In the context of the G20 presidency, she's acted as a chair's assistant of the Italian team of the Development Working Group. Hence, in this role, she's been a key player in contributing to the definition of the Development Working Group priorities and work. And hence, she will be an excellent person to keep this discussion forward. Next, we have Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who's the Chief Executive of the SAIA, South African Institute of International Affairs. She's been in this post since 2005, and she's got over 2 decades of experience in the field of politics and international relations, particularly in the context of South Africa, foreign policy and South-South cooperation. She's published widely on these themes, and she's been editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of International Affairs. In December 2020, she was also appointed within the second high-level advisory board of UNDESA. With reference to the Think 20 and G20 process, she's been co-chair of the Think 20 Africa Standing Group and currently is co-chair of the Task Force on Development Cooperation and the SDGs. We have next Federico Bonaglia, who's Deputy Director of OECD Development Center and supports the director in establishing strategic directions of the center, implementing its work, and strengthening its engagement and impact. Prior to this current role, Mr. Bonaglia was Senior Counselor to the Director and led the Center Policy Dialogue Division. And in this capacity, he was responsible for strengthening the engagement of the Center with governments, non-state actors, and represent the Center and OECD within the G20 Development Working Group. So you see, we have put together a stellar panel of key actors in this process. We also wanted to contribute to this discussion by providing a platform for key stakeholders from think tanks in the broader region of Africa and LDC. We have with us Sheikh Tidiane Dieye, who's the founder and executive director of the African Center for Trade, Integration and Development, CACID, a Senegalese think tank that is member of Venda Tiers-Monde Network. Dr. Dieye is a member of West African EPA Negotiating Committee and several technical committees within ECOWAS. He participated in multiple WTO ministerial conferences as member of the Senegalese delegation, and is lecturer in various universities in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tanzania, as well as in UNCTAD. And finally, we have James Eruwaginalunga, who's Executive Director of the Ugandan think tank Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiation Institute, SEATINI. She's an expert on trade, tax, and investment-related issues at the multilateral, regional, and national level. She also has more than 20 years of experience in policy research, analysis, and advocacy, having sat in several national policy-making bodies and advised the government and parliament on trade, tax, and investment-related issues. With this presentation, I would like to kick off the discussion by starting from Loredana Magni and asking her to reflect a bit on the main initiatives that have been put together by the Italian presidency to reflect and bring forward some of the priorities of African and LDC countries, and perhaps draw some lessons for next G20 future presidencies. Loredana, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, Valencisi and Giovanni, and also the chair and the previous, speakers. And let me start and say good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all participants here today with us. And I'm very delighted to participate in this webinar organized by the Istituto Affari Internazionali, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, on this important theme that has just been illustrated by previous speaker on how the G20 can bring forward the voice of the LDCs in its policy agenda. So the theme that you have chosen is highly relevant because the COVID-19 crisis has exposed to the different vulnerabilities, lots of developing countries and also LDCs. And in particular, your study report provides some very useful indication on how to engage the voices of these countries. And we are very glad about this important study. The impact of the crisis also highlighted the importance of multilateralism cooperation to design and coordinate the response and ensure the provision of global public goods. The G20 has a key role to play in this regard and has been playing this year. And I would like to thank you for having invited me to provide some of thoughts on how the G20 has been contributing to all your reflections on illustrating your report. In particular, what I'm talking about now, my intervention is structured in two parts. And the first point will be on how to achieve sustainable development can help address the vulnerabilities of that characterize mostly the LDCs. The Italian presidency has placed the recovery from the crisis at the center of its discussion, including in the development area all this year. And as a presidency, we focus on the promotion of actions to achieve a more inclusive and sustainable society supported by adequate investment for people, planet, and future prosperity. We've been advancing a response to the immediate need of overcoming this crisis, mobilize more liquidity, and ensure access to vaccine are at the most the urgent priority. These are both key concerns for the LDCs, and so we've been acting on that. The G20 has also taken important measures to respond to liquidity needs of the most vulnerable countries. This includes the extension of the debt service suspension initiative that was just mentioned until the end of 2021, the approval of the common framework for debt treatment beyond the SSI, negotiation for an ambitious replenishment of IDA 20, the Future Africa Development Fund replenishment in 2022, and the IMF allocation of new special drawing rights equivalent to as no 650 billions, and their possible channeling on a voluntary basis to the benefit of vulnerable countries. As you know, tomorrow in Washington, G20 discussion on this measure will be continued by the ministers of finance and central bank governor also, and they will focus on the assessment of options for voluntary channeling as a share of the allocation of SDR to help countries in critical conditions. So we are moving ahead the agenda there. On the vaccination front, the LDC also face a major challenge, and this has been illustrated by a previous speaker. LDCs mentioned that home to 14% of the world's population, but they have received, as you say, only 1% of a COVID-19 vaccine. So I think all of you know that at the global Rome Global Health Summit, G20 leaders reaffirmed the role of the extensive COVID-19 immunization as a global public good, and the need to scale up efforts to enhance timely, globally, and equitable access to vaccine, therapeutic, diagnostic, and personal protective equipment. To boost this action on a new G20 finance health architecture is going to be considered at the G20 Joint Finance Health Ministers meeting at the end of this October. So we expect to be able to advance also some discussion there in operational terms in this area. Beyond the response to emergency, the G20 is putting towards action to promote a lasting, inclusive, and more sustainable recovery. In fact, the response to crisis can be an opportunity to address the vulnerability that have hold LDC back and help them accelerating progress on the SDGs. Specifically, thanks to the work of the Development Working Group, the G20 has put in place several initiatives around three main themes, which are highly relevant for the long-term recovery and development of LDCs. And in addition to these three main themes, gender equality, youth empowerment, and One Health approach were also part of the definition of the main content of these initiatives. The first theme has been the food security and nutrition. It's known that many LDCs, for example, in Sahel and West Africa region, are confronted with a multiple crises. And the number of people displaced by armed violence in the Sahel is increasing, and the combined effects of insecurity, disruption, supply chains, drought, locusts plunged over 50 million people in a food crisis in the region. With the current trends, the number of people affected by hunger global would exceed 840 million by 2030. And the COVID-19 pandemic is like to have according to the recent figures, add 161 million people to a total number of undernourished in the world. So most of these people live in LDCs. And building upon on these premises, the G20 Foreign Affairs and the Development Ministers adopt at Matera Declaration, a call upon the international community to build sustainable, inclusive, and resilient food system and to ensure food security and nutrition for all by joining the Food Coalition Initiative. Another aspect, another theme, which was considered by the Development Working Group was the financing for sustainable development, which had also been indicated in your report. So the impact of the COVID pandemic in developing countries, in particular LDCs, are increasing financing needs while reducing available resources to implement crisis mitigation and recovery measure and the achievement of the SDG. So within the DWG, in close coordination with the G20 finance track, we focus on promoting enhanced mobilization alignment and the impact of all available resources of finance, public and private and domestic international towards the SDGs and address the increasing SDGs financing gap in the developing country. In particular, what we did, we focus our deliverable on supporting the great uptake on operationalization of integrated national financing framework as the SDG financing strategies in line with the national priority. And secondly, we promoted the transparency and development impact in the uptake of a sustainability-related financial instrument, such as the green and social sustainability bonds in developing countries. And thirdly, we developed a G20 common vision and voluntary reporting principle for SDGs alignment of the use of fiscal space. Now, moving to, we had another third theme, as I indicated initially. This was the territorial development SDG localizations. So we look at that, the local authorities are on the front of both emergency response and the recovery efforts, and are all well placed to localize the SDGs within local communities. In particular, as a G20, we recognize that intermediary cities offer a significant transformational potential for achieving the SDGs at the local level. However, there are often overlooked, the intermediate city, in national and international action. So this year, under our presidency, the G20 agreed to establish a G20 platform on SDG localization and intermediary cities that will help mobilize political support and maximize synergies across this initiative to address some of the major gaps that these cities are facing to realize their potential. So all these priorities have also received a political momentum through the endorsement of the G20 ministers. So we host 3 ministerial meetings, which was they organized with the Joint Affairs and Development Ministerial Meeting on food security and nutrition, ministerial meeting dedicated to development and the international cooperation, and the ministerial event on humanitarian assistance. So these 3 meetings, in these 3 meetings, the Italian presidency reaffirmed the commitment of G20 countries to address the impacts of the pandemic and the crisis on developing countries and the most vulnerable population. Also, raising the profile of the sustainable development agenda within the G20, which we trust that successful outcome of this meeting may also be an impetus for future G20 presidency for them to continue prioritizing sustainable development in their own agenda as a G20 presidency. So now moving quickly to another aspect is the second part is how the G20 can bring forward the voices of LDCs in its policy agenda. First, the G20 lacks a proper consultation mechanism with the LDCs. This year, with our presidency, we adopted an open and inclusive approach on a G20 discussion, inviting engagement groups, developing countries, and regional institutions such as the African Union and UNCTAD, as well as the regional development banks, including the African one, to join the deliberation on the deliverables on the development dimension. Building on this experience, future G20 presidency could design mechanisms for outreach and dialogue with relevant organizations such as the UN Committee for Development Policy, the LDC coordination mechanism in the UN, and the international organization working on LDCs to inform G20 discussions and bring forward the voice of the LDCs on the G20 policy agenda. Second, and related to the forthcoming United Nations LDC 5 conference, which will take place in Doha in January next year, is a good opportunity to build new synergies between the G20 and the LDC agenda. The LDC 5 conference will agree on a program of action for LDC 20 in the period of 2021 and 2031, and hopefully strengthening the international support mechanism for the LDC and ensure a smooth graduation for the countries that will exceed the LDC category. The LDC 5 conference will take place at the early stage of the Indonesian G20 Presidency, and its final outcomes may thus be particularly timely to feed into the G20 discussion in 2022 and beyond. So we do see there potential for strengthen and advance the voices of these countries. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the multiple crises in LDC and the long-term carrying on this country. And it is urgent to devise ways for the G20 and the international community to support effective LDC and the most vulnerable populations to recover from this crisis and address the consequences of climate change, while paving the way for a sustainable socioeconomic growth of this country. As a G20 presidency, Italy has designed an ambitious agenda and set of deliverables and is ready to support stronger G20 reflection on how to support LDCs to build forward better. Beside this reflection, I'm certain that today's workshop will highlight other important issues that we can bring to the attention of our G20 colleagues. To this effect, I'm very much looking forward to listen to you, to your ideas and proposals that you think we as Italian presidency could bring to the attention of G20 members and to the future G20 presidency around the possible ways to bring forward these voices of the LDCs in our G20 policy agenda. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Loredana, for the excellent discussion. I think there are two common threads I could identify in the wealth of information and reflections you shared. One is the interrelated nature of sustainable development, with crisis cascading from the health dimension to the socioeconomic one to the environmental, possibly even with some implications at political level and security level. The other one is the timeliness of this discussion in relation particularly to support for the LDC group. Now, this links well, in my view, with some of the findings of the study and the ideas that we would like to discuss building on that study, and in particular with the challenges for LDC institutional capacities in dealing with these interrelated dimensions interacting with each other. We've also seen that one of the issue that undermines somewhat the legitimacy, but also the effectiveness and uptake of G20 initiatives is precisely the weak agency that LDC and African countries have so far had in this process. And on this specific topic, I would like to bring on Elizabeth Sidiropoulos to reflect upon ways in which the G20 could better enhance this agency and the role that the T20 African Standing Group could play in bringing forward this agenda in the next G20 presidencies. Elizabeth, over to you.
Right. Thanks very much, Giovanni. Thank you to UNCTAD and to EI for the invitation and for this very topical issue that comes at a very important critical time. I think it's really useful to, it's a useful segue from what Signora Magni said right at the end in terms of the mechanisms that the G20 could consider with regard to the LDCs. And I want to make a couple of observations in that regard. Firstly, I think your point, Giovanni, in your introduction about weak agency is so significant in any consideration around mechanisms for the G20 to engage with the LDCs, because we know from other experiences that you may create representation in one form or another. You may create a seat at the table, but then how those countries, whichever countries or regions or groupings are invited, how they use that seat is critical. And that speaks to institutional capacities, to time, to resources, and so on. And so when discussing this issue of African agency and how the G20 can better engage with the LDCs, I think we need to see it from both perspectives. There are things that the G20 can do, and there are things that the LDC groups and African states also need to do in order to make this much more effective. As Senora Mani indicated, the G20 has adopted a fairly open approach over the years to engaging with different countries and stakeholders. There is, you know, the AU and AUDA NEPAD have been regular observers, they're permanent observers in the G20 process. They're also involved in some of the work streams. From time to time, other countries are invited depending on the, as observers, depending on the particular presidency. And we have a number of engagement groups, which as was attested by anybody who followed the Think 20 discussions, the summit last week, are not just G20 think tanks. They are think tanks from across the world. And that is what is so important about the way in which the G20 has evolved over time. So if we then just look specifically at what the G20 can do. So some of the, I think, the proposals that Senora Mani indicated, I think are very appropriate. And there are other ways also of bringing member states into some of these conversations, or states. The Development Working Group is clearly an important vehicle for that. It has been the focus of a lot of the development, the G20's development discussions and outreach, and focus on developing economies more broadly. But of course, that's one dimension of it. And she also very importantly highlighted how critical it is to have that interaction with the finance track, because the finance track often sits with the money. And the Sherpa track is important, but the finance track is often the one that needs to be brought into many of the discussions around development. For example, on illicit financial flows, the discussion was happening in the Development Working Group, but there is a very clear link with the financial track. And so some of the ideas that we have been considering and putting on the table are: can we create an outreach mechanism, a more systematized outreach mechanism between the G20 and initially potentially with just the Development Working Group and other LDCs and African states? One can discuss how you represent that. To make that systematic, though, and to also ensure that the way in which the LDCs engage on that is not constantly rotational, like we see with the AU and AUDA NEPAD, who change every year because it's on a rotational system with whoever is chairing the AU at the time. That creates difficulties to build up capacity and expertise and know-how. Because the other dimension and the other challenge that rests with LDCs and African states is: how do you ensure that through the creation of such an outreach platform, we maximize the opportunities for putting things on the agenda, for influencing the discussions on particular issues? How do we do that meaningfully? And that means, African states, LDCs, have to expend time and effort. They have to build up resources, capacity, and so on. I think there is a fundamental role there for international cooperation and engagement to build up institutional capacity. But there needs to be more than simply, I'm going to be sitting in this position for a year, and so why am I going to invest also through my ministries of foreign affairs, my finance, and so on and so forth. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is for LDCs also in an informal way almost to also use the Emerging Economies Caucus within the G20 as a way of engaging initially in many of these discussions. Some of the studies that have been undertaken around the extent to which agency is displayed in particular global multilateral discussions talk to the point that in fact people that often countries feel intimidated or feel that they lack the expertise and the technical know-how to actually really engage on the topics and to try to put topics on the agenda. And so these are ways of helping to build up capacity so that they can, into the medium term, actually engage more effectively. Let me then just make one last point about that, and then just talk a little bit about the G20 Africa Standing Group, if you want, Giovanni. And that really relates from the G20 perspective. It is so important to reflect on policies that are coherent in terms of assisting LDCs. Too often, advanced economies, but also G20, give with the one and actually take, whether it's inadvertently or not, with the other. So if you're talking about enhancing, for example, Africa's market access for agricultural exports, which was something that was discussed and is an ongoing discussion, but say in some of the communiques over the last few years, but you need to reflect on how that is affected by the ongoing domestic agricultural subsidies in some of these countries. So that coherence in the European Union, I think it was what called policy coherence for development, is critical. If I just then move very quickly on to some of the issues that we at the G20 Africa Standing Group have identified as important. They, of course, are very much rooted in what previous speakers have said over the last few minutes, and specifically, I want to make the point that the Africa Standing Group is not just about African think tanks working on G20 issues, but it's actually bringing together African think tanks and G20 think tanks, and I think that's very important. But 5 specific issues that we thought were critical at this in this COVID time. The first was really, how do we determine vulnerability? And different international organizations use different metrics. And in the context of debt sustainability, of course, a lot of it is focused on your definition as an LIC or not. We know that vulnerability is not simply whether you qualify on a particular GDP basis. And the crisis has shown that countries, even those who have just recently graduated, are seriously affected, and indeed, as are countries that might be much higher in their income, but are actually characterized by significant inequalities. And my country, South Africa, is one such example. So how do we determine vulnerabilities? So rethinking the norms regarding concessionality, grants, commercial terms, classification criteria, all of that I think is very important. The second point relates to growth and trade. And I know my 2 other colleagues from Africa are probably going to talk much more about that, but it really also speaks to, we have a significant opportunity here in the African context with the African Continental Free Trade Area, but its success is premised on building productive capacities and industrialization. And how do we work together in terms of the global superstructure to make sure that we're actually that our attempt to build regional value chains, create productive capacities, isn't undermined, whether it is intentionally or otherwise, by sort of rules out there that impact on us. The third and very important point is that about green transitions and just transitions. COVID, the whole discussion in the COVID pandemic has been about how do we use these significant stimuli that many countries have managed to put together to actually transform our economies. But there are costs, there are trade-offs to that. And we've got to make sure in the case of LDCs that those trade-offs do not further set back the Agenda 2030 and the development goals that, and Paul, I think, really provided some startling statistics in that regard. And I think this balance between, can we make sure that this transition is actually fair and just? And that does require particularly countries in the north to really think about what they are proposing in terms of the green transition. The fourth point relates to financial aid architecture. And again, I think this is a point that has been raised by you and others earlier. In what ways can we, I think it is time for a rethink about the way in which the financial aid architecture is structured, whether we're talking about SDRs, and I think that discussion is really useful, whether we're talking about how we can, countries, LDCs and African countries can access capital markets without creating additional burdens in terms of their debt. And fundamentally, I would argue, and it was interesting to hear that the World Bank president actually spoke about that yesterday. How do we create, do we need to really move on creating a framework for state bankruptcy? Or do we have this constantly around countries' necks that actually deters their ability to move forward? And then lastly, an important point around donor coordination, and that is the extent to which I think there's been a bit of an erosion of the aid effectiveness agenda in terms of harmonization, coordination, policy coherence, and that kind of thing. And the way in which the private sector has also, I think, very importantly come into the conversation, but where that has now, this repurposing of ODA has really shifted the goalposts and accountability mechanisms and so on, and without necessarily the recipient countries being part of that conversation. And then lastly, South-South cooperation, which is much more fluid, but where I think accountability and simplicity in terms of how that's coordinated is also important to not add to the burden of LDC management of some of these processes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think your intervention speaks to some of the issues, interestingly, that we've addressed in past LDC reports on the relation between policy coherence, but as well as the amount, of course, of development finance that is made available to LDCs. And it was interesting to hear that you also referred to the erosion of the aid effectiveness agenda, which is something we've noted in the past, even calling for an aid effectiveness agenda 2.0 to enhance this policy coherence, particularly in relation to climate change, which is an area where least developed countries face really tough trade-offs. I think another interesting point you raised, both in your intervention and in previous contribution, is the fact that continuity of action, both on the LDC parts, continuity of engagement, but also from the very G20, is one of the issues that creates potential problems in terms of enhancing this agency. And on this point, I would like to give the floor to Federico Bonaglia, asking him to discuss a bit, first of all, how to best monitor the use of post-COVID recovery plans to make sure that these much needed resources are utilized with the greatest development footprint. And secondly, also perhaps to draw some ideas on how we could ensure some legacy across G20 presidencies, which is something that was noted as very important for the future. Federico, you have the floor.
Thank you, Giovanni. Good afternoon, and it's an honor to be in this distinguished panel. Before trying to address your very relevant question, let me congratulate you and Istituto Affari Internazionali for having put together a very nice report. And let me also congratulate the friends in UNCTAD. And I saw that Rolf was also somewhere on the screen for a very interesting LDC report, as usual. It's an important intellectual contribution, but also political contribution to help moving the agenda forward. So congratulations, colleagues, for another excellent report. Let me try to address your question, Giovanni. I will try to address them quickly and then move to something which is related but slightly different and maybe a bit more forward-looking. How can we ensure that the resources that are being mobilized are used for development impact? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the resources that have been mobilized are very limited. If you compare the size of the fiscal stimulus in advanced economy, developing countries, and the LDCs, you clearly see, these are IMF data, that the difference is very large. And this speaks to the fact that, unfortunately, LDCs have a relatively limited fiscal base, and they also have limited access to borrowing and capital markets. And despite many pledges, they still receive insufficient development assistance, irrespective of the fact that there have been commitments that have been made to increase the assistance to the LDC. So we have to start from the point that resources that were mobilized domestically are limited because of these constraints, and that the additional resources that are being mobilized through, for example, the exceptional allocation of special drawing rights are also going to benefit only marginally the LDCs. If my memory serves me well, I think that the share of the LDCs, of the 46 LDCs in the Bretton Woods institutions, is 2.6%. So of the 650 billions of SDR that have been released, only 2.6 are directly going to the 46 LDCs. So we're talking here about a very small amount, relatively small amount of money. Of course, there are countries that have pledged to redirect their SDR allocations towards the most vulnerable countries. And I think that those countries should be taken as an example, and other countries, especially in the G7, which is the biggest recipient of SDR, should follow that example. There might be some technical challenges in terms of how to do it, but I think that we shouldn't be stopped by technical challenges confronted with the biggest crisis of our lifetime, if not more. So the first point is limited resources mobilized. Then how to align those resources to the priorities. I think that here the Italian presidency of the G20 has tried to do something quite innovative, and I would like to congratulate Loredana and the colleagues. It has been innovative both in terms of the topic and in terms of the approach. The approach, because for the first time, I think the Sherpa track and the finance track have tried to work together and have a kind of dialogue where the development window of the G20, which is the development working group, and the finance window of the G20, the finance group, try to talk to each other and come up with a joint agenda. And here, the idea of developing a common vision on the use and alignment of the fiscal space that is being created by G20 actions, I think is a very interesting example of what could be done. It is not meant to be a set of conditionalities. I think that this is important to be stressed. It's rather meant to be a peer learning exercise where, for example, let's say African countries that are already engaged in peer review mechanisms in the framework of AUDA and EPAD could look at each other and say, we have designed some effective mechanism for monitoring the use of fiscal resources and the impact of those resources. And by showing that these resources are used and are having an impact, this can be helpful for leveraging and attracting more of those resources. This brings me to my second point, which is about the continuity of issues. And I will address it in a slightly different way than what I talked after I listened to Elizabeth, that always gives me good ideas. I think that here we need to distinguish the question of the issue of voice from the question of issues. So there are mechanisms for strengthening the voice of the LDCs in the G20. Some of those were put on the table, and I will not repeat them. But then there are also questions of how to make sure that the G20 is addressing the issues that are relevant for the G20. And of course, if you have people with voice, this is probably a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for this to happen. And so we need to have also G20 champions that support those issues. And here, what is the role of the G20? I mean, the G20 can either work on the drivers, so let's say on the policy coherence agenda, or on the drivers of what determines the development pathway of LDCs, or they can work in the framework of the international support mechanism for post-graduation or for the LDCs. On the first group of items, South Africa, for example, has been probably the strongest voice in supporting a stronger action of the G20 on illicit financial flows. And let me tell you that this has not been easy, and I think that has not been enough. There has not been enough action in this area. the European Union has been probably the biggest supporter of South Africa in this battle, but more should be done. There are other important issues that are relevant for the LDCs that the G20 could address. The issue of vulnerabilities, rethinking the international agenda through the lenses of vulnerabilities will bring about important changes, especially when those vulnerabilities compound each other. Think about low levels of economic diversification and high exposure to climate change, where you have the recipe for, unfortunately, a development disaster. Unfortunately, we still look at international cooperation on the basis of levels of income, rather than thinking about metrics of vulnerability and in terms of self-interest. Let's face it. So I think that this is something where the G20 should do more. And let me conclude by saying that there is one issue that I think the G20 is well placed to help address the multiple vulnerabilities that affect the LDCs. And there should be some way for the G20 to leverage the Doha conference, the LDC5 conference, to build an agenda that is relevant for the LDCs, but not only, and where the G20 can help on both sides, on the driver's side and on the so the policies that the G20 themselves put in place that have a spillover effect, and on the international support mechanism side in terms of what kind of support mechanisms, aid for trade, market access, investment facilitation, you name it, technology transfer, that could be helpful for addressing vulnerabilities. To me, this agenda has one very specific name, which is called productive capacities. And it can be an organizing framework to address many of the vulnerabilities that the LDCs face. If you think about how you produce and how you consume, you inevitably think about the footprint, the carbon and the environmental footprint. You inevitably have to think about debt and borrowing and how you finance your policies. And so rather than having a long list of many issues that are all priorities, I think that there should be a concerted action. And here the Committee on Development Policies has been quite clear in its advice to the international community to focus on the productive transformation agenda for the LDCs as an organizing framework for addressing many of the other vulnerabilities. Here, I would even have a very concrete proposal to make, which I think in Doha, we could have a group of LDCs and a group of developing countries that are probably closer to the LDCs in terms of their challenges and experiences that could engage in a peer learning mechanism about production transformation agendas. Let me be very clear, and I conclude here. When I read analysis that said not enough private investment goes into the LDCs, this is worrying, but also leads me to say, and so what? I mean, what can we do to make sure that more investment goes into the LDCs? And if there are no investment opportunities, so if there is no strategy for industrialization in these countries that is credible and that has continuity, no investment will go into these countries. And we hear in many G20 countries that there is a return to industrial policy. The US, the EU, France, Japan, and others. So why not in the LDCs? And going back to the coherence point, how can we make sure that we create the necessary space for LDCs and developing countries to experiment and to build this productive capacity, very much in the same way that our own countries are investing to build the industry for the future. I conclude here. I don't know whether I was able to address your question, Giovanni. If not, my fault. Sorry.
I think you were spot on. And as you know, talking about productive capacities to UNCTAD, you're preaching to the converted in many ways. So we are definitely on the same point there. That's an excellent link also to the next panelist, which is Sheikh Tidiane. And I would like to ask him, talking about productive capacities, we all know about the infrastructural gap of African countries and African LDCs, and how important that is in weighing down the competitiveness of local firms and so on. Now, my question would be, what are the critical bottlenecks to unleash this infrastructural development and taking into account climate resilience as a key emerging and growing concern, and how to best link this development to the productive capacity agenda and to the aspiration of Africa to become a prosperous and integrated continent, with both reference to the hard infrastructure, so to speak, but also ITC and digitalization, which is clearly an emerging area of development that COVID-19 has, brought to the highest attention so far. Sheikh, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Giovanni. I would like, first of all, to thank UNCTAD and also to say congratulations for the report that you have done, which is very, very good one. Building productive capacities is an essential condition for the African development process. And the main example that we can take now is this IFCFTA, which is under a process. You know that this agreement is very important for all the African stakeholders and also all the states, civil society, private sector, and so on. But we all know that the lack of productive capacity is one of the main challenges. So building those productive capacities would be the kind of a prerequisite for this IFCFTA to be successful. You know that it is an agreement, and as it is a free agreement, free trade, and like any such agreement, its strengths and weakness, its advantages or challenges lie in also in the economic conditions in which it is implemented. And we all know that in Africa, it is really a challenge, and those challenges related to productive capacities can be seen. I can just give some examples that we all know, but the most well-known are the problem of infrastructure, as you said, and also logistics, problem of energy, transport, but also infrastructure on what I call the human economy, such as water, health, sanitation, and so on. You know that also the weakness of human capital is a problem. Access to technology, mobilization of resources, and finance for investment. All of these are very important in Africa, but they remain very deep and great challenges. Coming back to this challenge of productive capacity, if you combine them with the fragmented markets that we have in Africa, it seems and it appears like something very, very difficult and very problematic for African countries. And if you take into account the enormous potential of the Africa that is partly explained by the abundance of natural resources, you would see that despite all those potentials, Africa has not yet succeeded to create the conditions for structural transformation. And one of the reasons is what I said, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of domestic capacities, and so on. And one of the objectives of IFCFTA is partly to resolve that problem, because it is also well known that if you see the problem that Africa is having, it is related to its model of integration into the global markets, which remain very unfavorable to the continent. And as it has remained Africa in the beginning of all the global value chains where Africa is connected, and the continent, most of the countries are just exporting raw materials, but are also importing finished products from the other markets. With just some exceptions in the continent, most of the countries, the most of which are LDCs, are still facing those problems related to their structural transformations and so on. And you can just take an example of the agriculture sector to better understand what I am saying. In this sector, most of the African countries have huge assets for production, but most of the that they produce here is exporting just after they have. So there's some examples that you can take here. If you take some LDCs countries like Burkina Faso with cotton, like Liberia with rubber, Chad and the others also for cotton, the cashew nut for Guinea-Bissau. Most of these countries have real assets in these products, but they are still just exporting those products because they don't have these productive capacities in the country in order to process, in order to gain in the value chains, in order to have some value added, but also create jobs and so on. So those challenges are now, of course, well known. And we know that if we do not succeed to transform the process and to change this paradigm, it would be difficult for IFCFTA to succeed and to meet the objective that we are looking for into this agreement. Because you know, one of the objectives also of IFCFTA is to try to do industrialization through trade, because in most of the processes of development that we know, industrialization came and then after production, trade could come. But in this level of Africa, here, IFCFTA, one of the objectives is to try to put the conditions for trade and also to make sure that investment would come and so on, to open up the trade and to boost the private sector, to boost also the industrialization and so on. So let me just say that if we want to make this agreement successful, one of the conditions is, as I said, we have some problems in the linkage between the African countries in the global value chains. We should, I think, go through the regional value chains. However, requires investment in infrastructures to support trade and industry. And there is also a need for mobilization of resources, both domestic resources, but also international aid, private sector investment, and so on. But let's be clear. When I talk about investing in infrastructure, I'm not just saying that African countries should follow the same path or strategy of the developed countries when they were in their process of development. Here, Africa has the opportunity to do something different and new by investing directly in infrastructure, as you say, resilient to climate, which are green, which can be in a long-term perspective, and so on. That could be something that I think should be supported, this strategy by G20. But to do so, we should know that the first thing is to change a bit the behavior. It is like to shift from this kind of short-term and purely utilitarian investment to long-term options on investment that have an impact in the real economy. And also, I think it would be important to abandon this idea of pure free trade option to promote with IFCFTA, but also how to, after IFCFTA, or also in the region, to promote sustainable, inclusive, and productive partnership between African countries and the G20 partners and so on. So not only promoting free trade, but investing on productive capacity, talking about preferences, not for trade, but for production, which would help African countries to better organize their process of production. And just let me ask this question: if we talk about regional value chains, if we talk about the role and place of Africa in the global value chains, we should ask ourselves if we should or we could continue talking about sustainability, equitable trade, and so on, or fair trade, if we can see that the cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana is turned or processed into chocolate elsewhere and nothing in these countries. If you see that rubber from Liberia is processed elsewhere in the world and nothing in Liberia, if you see that also cotton from all these countries are processed elsewhere and not in those countries because they don't have these capacities, no energy, weak human resources, not access to technology, and so on. I think G20, if they really want to talk about development and sustainable development, they should see where are the real needs of African populations and invest into those needs. And finally, one of the opportunities, one of the elements that now can help also Africa to reduce also a bit its vulnerability, if we take the good actions, is these solutions that came from this COVID-19 pandemic. We know that not only Africa have revealed some of its vulnerabilities in the pandemic. Most of the countries in the world also, we see that most of them have their own vulnerabilities, but we can also see that elsewhere and here in Africa, it was the second point that you were raising, how we can use these the e-trade, this digital economy, to use it in Africa as a kind of new tool for the continent to be able to reduce a bit its challenges and to take advantage on that. And you are right. Some of the countries are doing very well despite the challenges that they are still facing. In Senegal, it is well known that the country has huge potential and opportunities on this, and the government is investing well on this Senegal strategy 2025 on boosting digital economy by taking 5 key actions. That would be the end of my speech. The first is on developing the supply and demand of e-commerce products in the country. Studies have been done to show where are the interest and opportunities, but also the assets of the country. The second is to identify and to invest on in the infrastructure supporting this digital economy, like internet, access to internet, the mobile phones, and all the infrastructure linked to that, but also build national skills and expertise in digital economy and e-commerce. That is very important, and I think this is also an area where G20 countries could help, could invest and support. Fourth, it is to mobilize financial resources. It is linked to what I just said. In the country, we don't have enough resources for that, but with the international support, G20 and the other partners, that could help. And finally, it is important to have a kind of a legal framework on this digital economy in the country. It is one of the key things that the government is working on. So that is what I wanted to share with you. I thank you very much for listening to me, and I give you back the floor, Giovanni. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sheikh. I think a lot of what you said is consistent with what we found in terms of international support measures for LDCs, where we long said trade liberalization is good, but can only go so far unless it's complemented by other policies that stimulate this process of productive capacity development and productive transformation. And I think one of these, this lesson could also be important in terms of the forward-looking agenda for a new generation of international support measures that needs to include in a meaningful way issues like technology transfer, in terms of opening opportunities to leapfrog. We could think about decentralized electricity generation. We could think of the digital economy. I think these are very important areas of concern. Nonetheless, as you rightly pointed out, if we really want to put our money where our mouth is, we need to recognize that the resources available for these investments are still minimal compared to the needs. Recently, as UNCTAD, we've estimated that the investment requirements for LDCs to achieve the SDGs range between 462 and 1,051 billion per year, depending on which SDG we take, but those related to structural transformation are longer term and would require, of course, much greater investment needs. And that links to the last intervention by Jane Nalunga, to whom I would ask to comment a bit about LDC's challenges in mobilizing this development finance in ways that are commensurate to their need, including through innovative mechanisms, of course, and also how we could improve on the initiatives that we've seen the G20 has already taken, but that have so far had only a limited impact on LDCs, such as, of course, the example we made before of the SDR allocation. Jane, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Giovanni, for giving me this floor. Distinguished panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good evening from Uganda. As Giovanni has pointed out, I'm going from an African perspective, discuss the issue of sustainable development finance for Africa, and also provide views on the initiatives on the table. But then I also give some views on how Africa can ensure an inclusive and sustainable post-COVID recovery. The previous speakers, especially Mr. Akiwumi, in his opening remarks has clearly articulated the enormous challenges facing Africa and LDC in the post-COVID, and the challenges which have been brought by the COVID pandemic. And with such challenges, the COVID pandemic has widened the financing gap in Africa and has also multiplied Africa's financial needs. Because of the challenges, the health challenges, economic challenges, the increasing debt, increasing poverty, increasing inequality. Therefore, Africa needs urgently sustainable development financing. But in addition to that, Africa also requires a conducive policy framework at the global level. And for me, the two have to go together. Welcome the initiatives which the G20 has put on table to address, to help LDCs address their challenges. It's really a step in the right direction, and it's really most welcome. The initiatives, as has been pointed out, includes the SDRs, blended financing, the DSSI, the common framework. These initiatives need a lot of improvement so that they can be able to work for LDCs to work for Africa. I'm just going to give some examples of where improvement is needed, just examples. For example, this issue has been raised, I'm emphasizing it. The SDRs were US dollars, $650 billion, and only just about 2% came to low-income countries. Therefore, there is a need to rechannel SDRs to poor countries who need it. And this rechanneling shouldn't include conditionalities. They should be flexible. On the issue of blended financing, it's also an initiative which has been put on table by the G20, but there is still lacking the evidence of the efficacy of blended financing. There's a lot of research which has been done by, for example, Development Initiative, by UNCTAD, to show the inherent risks in PPPs and blended financing. Therefore, my point here is that the role of ODA in blended financing should be to increase available resources for targeting poverty, rather than pursuing private investment through blending as an end in itself. I think we need to be clear about this so that we look at the issues of transparency, its potential risks and potential benefits. There is also the issue of using resources, especially the loans prudently. We need responsible borrowing, but again, we need also to put on table the issue of responsible lending, and we have seen irresponsible lending to a number of LDCs. In addressing the post-COVID recovery in Africa, we talk about building back better, building back greener. And I think broadly, we need a reform of the global trade, debt, and the multilateral trading system. We need to reform the debt architecture. We need to reform the tax architecture. We need to reform the multilateral trading system. And I think the G20 can play a key role in these reforms. We need to address the democratic deficit in all those processes. We need a truly inclusive and transparent intergovernmental processes at the multilateral level. I found the issue of agency very interesting in the report, really, really interesting. But for me, I still believe that it's important to be on the table. African countries have to be on that table. There are issues of voice, issues of issues, but African countries, LDCs, have to be on that table. As the saying it goes, either you're on that table or you are on the menu. And for me, I think there is some truth in that. So the process is really as important as the outcome. So we need to address the democratic deficit. If the G20 is talking about reforms, assisting LDCs, assisting African countries, let those countries be on the table. And that's why we are talking about a UN tax commission, a UN tax convention to address those issues of tax havens, tax abuses, and IFFs. I want to say briefly something about the reforming of the multilateral trading system. I think it's agreed that the multilateral trading system needs to be reformed globally, but it's the how should it be reformed. There are long-standing issues which the Africa group has been, and the LDC group have been putting on table. But then there are also now new issues which African and LDC countries are putting on the table. The new issue as regards the COVID pandemic is the issue of access to vaccines. We need flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement. This is an issue being discussed, and I hope, we have hope that this issue will be resolved, the issue of patents. The issue of digitalization, this is what, again, COVID has taught us. E-commerce digitalization is very important, but the negotiations in the WTO should ensure equal benefit for all. They also, as part of the long-standing issues, there are issues around agriculture, issues around subsidies, public stockholding for food security, issues of special safeguard mechanisms, implementation issues, special and differential treatment. These are issues which are falling off the agenda of the WTO. Yet, if we are talking about moving forward a sustainable and inclusive post-COVID agenda, these are issues which we need to put back on the agenda. On the issue of investment, we also need investment in the post-COVID agenda era. We need investment, but the investment policy framework at global level, national level, regional level needs to change. We need to put human rights. I think we need to ensure coherence between the UN processes and the WTO negotiations. When we talk about the SDGs, food systems in the UN, those issues should link up to the agriculture negotiations in the WTO. We need to rethink the role of the private sector, and then also we are looking for support for the CFTA from the G20. I think I will stop there. Thank you so much, Giovanni.
Thank you very much. I think your intervention again was pointing to the issues of policy coherence. Before giving the floor to Daniele for moderating the question and answers, I would like to give first the microphone to Katrin Beresman to discuss a little bit bring back the discussion to the more specific issues treated both in the report and in the work of the G20. Katrin.
Thank you very much. Katrin Beresman, German Development Institute. I would like to add three issues on development finance, what has already been said. First, the role of the G20 with regard to the allocation of the special drawing rights, in addition to shifting money or shifting financial resources from rich countries to poor countries by donating or providing credits. Another possibility is to establish a special purpose fund, such as a green fund or a health fund, which is discussed at the IMF currently to support developing countries or LDCs. Second, with regard to the role of the G20 to address the debt problem in LDCs, while the common framework beyond the SSI is a very good framework, it has been difficult to operationalize it because first we have intercreditor, we need intercreditor equity, and this can only be ensured if the G20 manages to involve also private creditors. So options to involve private creditors should be discussed and established, and should discussed, of course, they discuss it with the Institute of International Finance in Washington. Nevertheless, there is some more room. In addition to that, the G20 countries by themselves need to make their debt contracts open and transparent for all creditors and for all creditors, so that we can ensure intercreditor equity. And third, with regard to the IFIs, it has already been mentioned, higher concessional windows of the MDBs. It would be important to provide a special replenishment of the concessional windows of the MDBs, and here the G20 could take on a front-runner role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrin, and thanks for staying in the time. Daniele, if you can take over to moderate the many questions arrived, so go ahead, please.
Yes, hello again. Thank you very much to the speakers and the panelists. I think you all gave an incredible overview of the many and several issues that are at stake. I'm very grateful that we managed to have such a broad representation of institutions, speakers, and topics. I've seen from the Q&A list that there are several points that have been raised, for instance, on the digitalization and the climate issues. Maybe I would like to, since we are 5 speakers, maybe Jane and Sheikh, you could answer to one of the 2 questions that are touching upon the LDCs. So, for instance, Sheikh, on the issue of infrastructure development, how do we ensure that this does not become a debt trap or a chess pieces? And maybe Elizabeth, you can also elaborate very briefly on this, because we know that geoeconomics and geopolitics are very much interlinked in this. And maybe I would ask at the end, Federico and Loredana, to see how we should expect in the next weeks these interlinked issues of climate agenda and development agenda end up in the leaders' declaration. How do you see this, and how do we ensure the policy coherence that we all raised in in the meeting. And Jane, as well, in your case, maybe you could elaborate again on the issue of how to ensure that these infrastructural and basic investments that are needed to fill the gap do not create further debt traps in the LDCs. But I would like to ask all of you to be very brief in your points. So 2 minutes maximum each. So Sheikh, you can start.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It will be very, very short. I think one of the challenges, and it is clear that it is a very important challenge that we should bear in mind to not create a situation where these needs of infrastructure became a kind of debt trap for African countries. One of the solutions, as I said, is not only letting private international companies investing or building those infrastructures, but working more on technology transfer and giving the opportunity to African countries inside the countries to build those infrastructures. It is, when I talk it like that, it is like it is a bit unrealistic, but it can be possible to transfer technology, to work on also expertise and so on, to reinforce the expertise in African countries so that they can have infrastructure that can be managed by themselves, that can be also created by themselves with the support of the international partners. So that is just one of the ways of looking at it. There are perhaps much more ways, but I think transfer of technology can be one of these things. And also putting like public-private partnership, helping with infrastructure that can be that are in the level of the needs of the country, not only building huge or big infrastructure that are not in the same level with the needs of the development of the country, but something that is really need by the population. That's why I said that we should now go for these real economy, these human economy for health, for education, and so on. On these sectors, I think something can be do and which would not be normally having a great impact on debt. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sheikh. And maybe Elizabeth, you can go, and after that, Jane.
Just on issues of the debt trap, I think the first point relates really to the modalities of financing of infrastructure, or more broadly, development. And so it speaks to the issue of how are we constructing sort of the architecture of financial aid. And I think we need to give some thought to that, particularly in this pandemic, because in Africa and the LDC, we're still in the pandemic and in the post-pandemic environment. Second point is really what Catherine said. I mean, the issue of transparency. And here I know it can be, often it can be geopolitical and it can be quite difficult. But I think it's also a push that African states and LDCs need to affect, that they actually should insist. In fact, a colleague of mine working on some of these issues has called for legislation, for a campaign and legislation in African countries to actually make sure that that loans and things like that are actually public and are transparent, and the conditions around that the same. And then lastly, I think, well, debt is not necessarily bad, provided it's not used for current expenditure, right? If it's to build up productive capacity. So I think we need to differentiate there, and there are issues that African and LDC countries need to factor in there. And then lastly, when we're structuring arrangements to assist with debt sustainability, we really need to structure them in a way that make them attractive to countries. So if we look at the DSSI, I mean, Catherine has already alluded to some of that. Some countries did not take that up initially because it was actually the incentives weren't there. There were downsides to it, whether it related to credit rating agencies or whatever. And so, you know, globally, we need to think about ways that make it easier. You know, what are the kinds of incentives that would encourage countries that that might otherwise be discriminated against in to okay, that's when I think I'm stop to take on these mechanisms that are supposed to help them.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jane?
Thank you so much. I agree entirely with the previous speakers on the issues of transparency, then issues of maybe what I can add on, issues of local content to ensure that the loans which have got to do these big infrastructures, some of the resources remain in the country, because we see most of in Uganda here, most of those huge infrastructure projects, the country which brings the loan is the country which brings the cement. It brings everything, even the labor, so that needs to change. There is the issue of readiness. I have seen in my country here, we get a loan, but we are not ready for it. You know, the infrastructure to absorb that loan, we are not yet ready, yet we are paying, we are servicing that loan. So the readiness, and also the link to the National Development Plan and the link to the investment plans. Most often we see that we get these infrastructure projects, but they are not part of the National Development Plan or the investment plan. And lastly, I think it's also important to look at, like Sheikh said, the productive infrastructure. You know, because we are concentrating on these huge dams, electricity dams, yet because of the nature of the negotiations with providers of the loan. For example, in Uganda here, we have so many dams and we have spent a lot on those dams, but the rate, the unit cost hasn't gone down, you know, and most people can't afford to connect to the national grid, and it has a problem with climate change. So I think we need to address all these issues to ensure that the infrastructure projects don't become a debt trap. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And now I'll give the floor to Federico and then afterwards to Loredana.
Thank you, Daniele. The question is a very tricky one. As Loredana knows, whenever you start discussing climate, green transitions in the G20 setting, this is when you know that there will be hours of drafting in front of you, because unfortunately, it's still quite difficult to get the G20 to agree on what to do with climate and development. And I think that here there is a solution to that, which speaks to the topic of today. On one end, I think that LDCs and developing countries' voices need to be better represented in the G20, because we often hear as a kind of excuse for the G20 not to have more ambitious language on climate, that this is because developing countries will be penalized. And I think that it's important that we have a serious conversation about whether this is the case, because clearly there are important trade-offs between climate and poverty eradication or development. But there are also ways of addressing those trade-offs. We were talking right before about infrastructure. You just think about urbanization patterns in Africa. A lot of the urban infrastructure that is necessary to support African transformation still needs to be built. How you build that infrastructure will have long and far-fetched consequences for the carbon footprint of African countries today. So even if Africa today has a very low carbon footprint, Africans are already suffering the consequences of climate change and of pollution, and the choices that they make today will have long-term implications. So it's not really an answer that I'm giving you, but it's just to signal that within the G20, there is still, unfortunately, lack of consensus, I would say, about being more ambitious on climate and development. One of the reasons is that there is this trade-off that is real or perceived about advancing in a greener way and fighting other important priorities like poverty eradication, food security, that in our view can be resolved. We should have climate lenses on when discussing about monetary policy, when discussing about infrastructure, when discussing about human capital development, etc. And so if you put these climate lenses on, you will also find ways to combine and reconcile poverty eradication with sustainability. I stop here.
Thank you. Loredana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And just to complement on Federico's comments, well, this year, what can we leave or what we can transfer to the COP26 in November? Certainly, as Federico was mentioning, the achievement, which was a very big achievement in having the first ever meeting of the climate energy sitting together. And if you look at the text of the communique already, there is a great recognition of some space for advancing a greener agenda there. So how much of this will be in the leaders' communique? I hope a lot. They're actually currently negotiating because there are meeting of the Sherpa. And so we do hope that the most of the content there in the document will be reflected in the leaders' communique. Of course, we're fully, as I say in my intervention, is important to try to identify a certain mechanism to ensure, to advance. Well, we have been improving within the DWG, the Development Working Group, so the group that is really looking at the development issues for partner countries, and so for LDCs, but that's how to ensure that the voices are there of African countries, LDCs are there. So when we stand up and push forward for a very ambitious agenda on the environment, there are countries there defending, because sometimes it's very complicated to defend the agenda that maybe other countries, G20 countries, they don't perceive, immediately the most appropriate way to forward in the future. So I think it's becoming very urgent to have a more structured way of ensuring a continuity over the presidency, because every year we change. So you may find a president more open, others more, not so open. But definitely this year we have a really reformed completely the way we worked. And through this new processes, we made a space to engage a wider, participants with the different, pertaining to the different, institutions or setting, in order to have the possibility to feed into as a sort of input. But the important thing is there is not only consultation, but how mechanisms to ensure that those are retained in the final documents. That is really key, because it can be lost during the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loredana, and we very much appreciate your time today, because we know these days are pretty dense and hectic for the negotiations and the finalization of the documents. So we really keep our fingers crossed that the topics and the mechanisms that you mentioned really manage to take the instances and the priorities of regions that are not necessarily represented, but are impacted by the leaders' decisions, are carefully taken into account. Before concluding the webinar, I would like to give the floor to Rolf Trager from UNCTAD. And after his intervention, I will give the floor to my colleague Ettore from my side, I would like to thank you for your interventions, and I suggest and I invite all the participants to keep writing and emailing us for any inputs or feedbacks they might have on the document, because they are extremely valuable, and we will try to take them into account. Rolf, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniele, and thank to all the speakers. I'd just like to make a very short remark on the issue of policy coherence that came up again and again in the interventions of the panelists. And here we are talking about coherence or alignment with national priorities, regional agendas, the discussions at the level of the G20. I mean, the theme of this event was bringing the voice of LDCs into the G20, but also there's another issue, which is the interaction between the G20 and the multilateral level. I mean, the United Nations is engaging, and all of its specialized agencies are engaging with the G20. And I think there are all sorts of initiatives trying to bring some sort of coherence, policy coherence between all of these different levels and institutions and these different forums. And I mean, UNCTAD 15, our ministerial conference, finished just last week with a call for revitalizing multilateralism. But even at the multilateral level, there are issues of coherence between the political decisions which are taken in New York or in the field of trade, what is decided at the WTO. And this is true for trade, for finance, and for technology. So I'd just like to recall that this issue of striving for coherence and between these different levels is very important for policy making at all of these different levels, and that there's a lot of work forward. And of course, we are trying to contribute to this with the current process, but also in some other ways. But it's very important to continue working in this direction. Thank you very much.
So again, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I think we have had a lively and fruitful discussion, which has indeed shed light on many relevant issues linked to our main subject today, how to increase LDCs agency in the G20 process. I think the discussion has offered a variety of perspectives, and has been an inspiring exchange of views. There have been many references to our joint UNCTAD IAI study. And again, I would like to invite all of you to have a look at it. It's been a result of a truly genuine common efforts to identify the most effective and promising avenues to increase the role of LDCs and within the G20 process, and give more prominence to their interests and concerns in the G20 process and agenda. I also would like to take this opportunity to invite you also to take a look at the policy briefs, statements, that we have already published, indeed, within the framework of our T20, which cover a wide range of issues, including some such as, for instance, food security and infrastructure investment, which we have analyzed even in broader terms, that have been mentioned several times in this seminar. And all those issues, of course, have obvious links with the prospect of advancing and deepen cooperation with LDCs. Our point of departure, of course, has been the huge and very heavy impact of COVID-19 pandemic, which has revealed strong vulnerability and structural deficiencies and weaknesses. Has been said, of course, has been a very worrying growth of poverty, and so also global inequalities have grown, and there we have witnessed also a deepening of asymmetries. We are now witnessing an economic rebound, but the analysts, of course, our government itself, are now warning that this rebound is important, but need to be made sustainable, and it is a very big challenge. There is the risk for our countries, but even more, as has been stressed, for developing countries, how to return to a sustainable development, because the risk of a prolonged sluggish growth is very serious, because we know that it can have very heavy and impactful social effect in those countries in particular. But of course, the pandemic has also emphasized, also highlighted the great interdependence. Globalization will continue to develop, although in different forms. And if we want really to save the planet and to ensure a stable economic and financial system, we need absolutely to increase our level of cooperation with LDCs and create new mechanisms for helping them to develop and address their problems. They have, of course, a very far-reaching implication for our societies too. All these has had effect, of course, the process toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that has been reversed. And of course, here is the first main task that we should identify for the G20, how to enhance the alignment of the ongoing processes and also policies with the SDGs. This is one of the main fundamental tasks of the G20. The second task I would like to emphasize is linked to its standard setting role of the G20. This role of the G20 sometimes is neglected, overlooked, as has been stressed by many interventions. There are a number of sectors in which the G20 can make the difference, because it can create a condition for advancing the process of creating parameter benchmarks and also rules in some cases. This is another essential role of the G20, which applies, of course, to also, in particular, the fields of finance and infrastructure. Mr. Davis said that one of our subtext of our paper is that multilateralism is weakening. That's the other very important role of G20, how to reinvigorate multilateralism. I think the G20 is the appropriate forum, and we have seen also from the experience of the Italian presidency to try to make this effort to relaunch multilateralism. But linked to that, this is the essential point that we have discussed in this meeting. The big challenge for the G20 is how to become more inclusive. This is, of course, a key condition to address effectively the questions that remains in any case very relevant of legitimacy of the forum. But this is another point that's been stressed, the problem of legitimacy in terms of including, of course, other actors to ensure their direct participation in the G20 process is the other side of the coin, which also includes the problem of effectiveness. All the problems that we have discussed cannot be, of course, effectively addressed without a different model of inclusion and cooperation with the LDCs. And so the biggest challenge for the G20 is how to make more stable and fully integrated the involvement of LDCs in its process. How, in a sense, this type of cooperation can evolve into a mutually beneficial real partnership. And finally, I would stress, this is of course a closely related link, that the G20 has an extremely important role to provide the political impulse to other institutional actors, all the G20 agenda, all the statements and positions they are approved within the G20 should then be implemented in other contexts by other actors. And this essential role of the G20 is to provide a key political impulse in that direction, because otherwise there won't be any follow-up or real implementation of what is agreed upon within the framework of G20. This points, of course, to a wider problem that has been raised several times also in this meeting, is the problem of the overall reform of global governance. In our meeting in particular, the points that have been more widely discussed is the reform of the aid architecture, but also the reform of the financial system. This has been at the center of the efforts undertaken by the Italian presidency, which indeed I would like to stress this point has been characterized by a real effort to introduce innovative mechanisms that has been already stressed in this meeting. What we need is clearly new bodies or rules in many sectors. Of course, the G20 doesn't have a direct regulatory role, but can have, again, even in this field, a very important, fundamental role of favoring a process leading in this direction, which is, of course, essential to enhance global governance. So just to conclude, I would like again to stress that I think this has been a very inspiring and thought-provoking, policy-oriented exercise. I think this has been for us an integral part of the work we have done within the framework of the T20. And I think in particular the partnership with UNCTAD has been for us a real incentive, and also given us a lot of suggestions and support in developing the work that we have done in the T20. So this type of our work in the framework of this project has been fully interactive with the work we have done within the T20. So I would like again to thank the UNCTAD team. The cooperation with the UNCTAD has been really very, very close from the very beginning. We have undertaken any step in this project, discussing deeply what should be done. I think has been a very useful cooperation. So many thanks in particular to the director Akigumi. I think the joint publication testified that this type of collaboration between an international actor and a think tank can have useful results. Again, I would like also to thank the coordinator of our report, in particular my colleague Daniele Fattibene, but also Giovanni Valencisi from UNCTAD, but also the authors again of the report, Elisabeth Sidiropoulos, Catherine Beresman, and again all our panelists and all of you for being with us today. I think our work may be, I hope, will be a good and solid base to deepen our research effort in view of the future
I think I would just associate ourselves with all the thanks. Stress that if we take Jane's saying, we are more than glad to have her and other think tanks from Africa and LDC on the table. We really think it's an important step towards bringing the voices of LDC and civil society, especially from LDC countries, into this debate. Thanks once again, and have a nice evening.